In this video, we'd like to talk with you about the concept of psychological insulin resistance. And this reflects the attitudes that our patients can have regarding how they use their insulin, whether it be beginning insulin with type 2 diabetes or even changing insulin doses with type 1 diabetes. The attitudes that our patients present are quite important. A quick aside, it's also worth thinking about the attitude of providers and what has been termed provider inertia around insulin in diabetes is also a relevant factor. So as we go forward, the attitude issue will become really quite important. And this is, I think, what's critical for us to appreciate is that the certain belief systems that people have will guide their behaviors. And this is an approach to understanding the attitudes that underlie psychological insulin resistance. It's important for us to appreciate that psychological insulin resistance often reflects core beliefs that the person has. And these beliefs turn out not to be very responsive to education. So if the person, believes that going on insulin means that their diabetes is now severe relative to not going on insulin. So starting insulin makes the disease worse in the patient's belief system. Now, any attempt by us to educate the patient that that's not the case won't really work. So we actually have to work through these attitudes. And it's really important to identify them. And so this, in essence, is a checklist. And this is the research work that's been done looking around insulin resistance, showing that the following types of attitudes. So perceiving that the disease is more serious, perceiving that it represents a failure, that there is not any confidence, or that means the person will lose control. And so these kinds of attitudes can become, in essence, an interview. So just imagine when you approached a patient, you could ask them questions like, do you feel that insulin will take control or freedom away from you? Do you think starting insulin means that you have failed? Are you nervous or anxious about injecting? Do you think that starting insulin will be more work than it's worth, that you will not get anything good from it? Do you think that starting insulin means your disease is more serious? Do you lack confidence about your ability to manage your diabetes using insulin? And this is an interview, and as a dialogue, you can see that it can be really very helpful. And this is where the self-management support concept, I think, becomes so helpful for us as providers. It's not our job to change the patient. It's not our job to convince the patient of anything. But if we can understand them and then keep the conversation going, then we can actually move this forward. And so this really is a contextual point that we can actually improve the willingness of individuals to increase treatment invasiveness. And this is something that we know about diabetes. The more we take advantage of technology, often the more involved the patient has to get. That's considered by us to be positive, but not necessarily considered by our patients. So what I'm going to show you now is what we call guided discovery. And that is a way of interviewing a patient, asking the patient questions that sort of guides them along a path towards self-management and towards increasing their input into their own diabetes management. So let's just take this through the lens of type 2 diabetes. Do you know that type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease? You could ask your patient that question. You then check out if the patient understands the word progressive, clarify what that means, and then ask the patient to teach that back to you. This is the really, really beneficial strategy of teach back, which is the best way of knowing whether your communication to your patient is actually sinking in. Then you follow that up with other questions that guide the patient down a pathway, such as, since your sugars will creep up on their own over time, that's the definition of type 2 diabetes, progressive type 2 diabetes, what does this mean about how you could control these sugars? What's your patient's perspective on that? Would you be willing to act early to stop the blood glucose levels from rising to the point where they can harm you? Does it make sense to you that increases in medical treatment will be needed eventually to control blood glucose levels? And can we talk about the possible role insulin might play in stopping this upward drift of blood sugars? Now, what's important to communicate here is that we don't focus so much on the answers to the questions, but on the opportunity to deliver the questions. The questions have a sequence to them, and what you're really hoping for is that your patient will start to get it. That is, they'll realize, hang on a second, you're right, sugars are going to creep up on their own. So what could I do? I don't know. Would you be willing to act? Well, that makes sense. Yeah. Does it make sense that increases in treatment? And can we talk about insulin? So I'm hoping that you can see that there's a guided aspect to this. And with collaborative communication, often this sets the stage that allows the patient to begin that journey of moving forward and re-examining the attitudes towards insulin. And I find it interesting that most of us in diabetes would say that when you've maxed out an oral medication, going on insulin is a good thing, when we know that the majority of our patients will think that going on insulin is a bad thing. So guiding them through an opportunity to examine and re-examine these beliefs becomes very helpful. Thank you.